Throughout the throwback videos, I've often described the worst as, well, it's from an early era, and thus, while the songs might get bad or messy, it's not like the artists in question are making this material nowadays. Or the worst of each year felt more like a collection of bad songs and less of, this is how bad things on the label got this year. And despite Aerochord's appearances being the only exception, everyone pretty much admits that he was a cold sore of what were otherwise really great years for the label. Both 2018 and 2019 have huge catalogs of great songs, and I don't think a top 10 covers the extent of that. 2020 was the year that changed. Maybe because I was paying more attention to the label and each release, but the worst of this year started a downward trend that never really went away. Where not only were the songs bad, a lot of them have this lingering feeling to them, where I remember way more of the worst of this year compared to years prior. It also doesn't help matters when there are so many new acts, and there was a large chunk of them that could not create that good first impression, and the majority of that fell into one sub-label this year. Instinct. For all the great songs Instinct was able to make in 2019, 2020 felt like the label was a husk of itself, either relying on acts that were slowly getting worse, new acts that hopped onto popular trends with little personality, or acts from Uncaged crossing over to deliver a song that was not worth the hype. And while there were occasional misses from Uncaged, a lot of that feeling started and stopped with the song or artist. Rarely did it feel like an issue with the label as a whole. Instinct was not so lucky. So much of the pop material felt way more bland than in previous years. It also doesn't help matters when Grant and Doomu were undercut compared to 2019 with their EPs, with Doomu only having 4 singles this year, none of which were as good as his last EP, and Grant was MIA throughout the whole year, outside of writing and vocal credits from Kuro songs. I know that Cloud9 and Direct were still around and were big names, but when you're relying so much on those two names, along with Conroy's Level Days, that's a big issue. If anything, a lot of this list feels like a teaser for the worst of 2021, since that's where the really disappointing feeling kicked in the most. Because I'll acknowledge that in terms of production quality, these songs aren't as bad as the worst of 2019, or even 2018. But because that feeling comes into play, it makes the worst feel a lot greater compared to previous years. So let's get on with the list proper. No remixes or VIPs, and only 2 artists per song in the top 10. With that said, starting the dishonorable mentions with a familiar name. Remember how I said Vicetone should probably stick to their pop and house genres because if they venture into other genres, it doesn't go well? Same applies here. 2019 was the start of Vicetone's turn into mediocrity, but I'd argue 2020 was where that feeling really set in. Animal was okay, courtesy of the Nevada formula, but I Feel Human got annoying fast with those vocal chants, and Shadow is yet another example of why feature-based Vicetone is so bad. It starts off with a decent lead melody until you realize that lead never gets utilized properly. Instead, it's left stranded on its own with a repeating vocal from Ali X, and the usual mediocre design from Vicetone, especially in the drops, which has a weaker melody, awkward percussion splatter, and the spacious leads have no character or personality behind them. And then it ends on a really sour note with that annoying bleeping synth and some horrible drippy horn accents. And keep this in mind, this isn't even the worst song off of Legacy. I know I said Instinct was the main culprit behind some of the worst material this year, but that doesn't mean that Uncaged didn't have a few low points as well. Like this pick, that shouldn't surprise anyone if you're familiar with these 2 names. I've already talked about Sullivan King multiple times on this channel, although someone else was a contender for the best list. But for Wooly, after looking back at his catalog before his melodic heavy pit, he was actually a decent British producer. Kinda made me rethink this whole position on Wooly's heavier side. It's not that Wooly's heavier side is always bad, more so Wooly is better off either staying melodic or staying heavy. Every time he tries to combine the two, it reveals his worst impulses. And unfortunately, Don't Forget Me is another case why on the heavy drop alone. The melodic drop is decent with those saw wave pads courtesy of Sullivan King and punchy percussion from Wooly. I also like the guitar riff integration for the final drop, but the heavy drop not only kills the tone since Wooly's goofier sound design doesn't have the menace it needs, Every drop by itself feels like a leftover from a bad Excision collab, like from the Evolution EP, with its repetitive nature and awkward robotic sound design that just hinders the drop as a whole. There's also the fact that Boss Fight's voices did the same formula and is much more effective, so it makes this feels like an inferior version. The melodic drops keep it off this list proper, despite this formula growing old and stale, especially from these two, and also the fact that these two have a collab that's much worse in a few years. If you've seen my past videos, you know what song that is, and it's only gotten worse over time. I know there's a large chunk of the community that likes this, and at the time of the release, I included myself in that picture, but as I revisited the song, oh wow, this just sounds awful. Although I can pinpoint why people might like this. That plucky lead in the drops actually sounds nice, and you can tell that came from Tony Romero, because everything else surrounding it can't back that lead up. The song starts off as a simple piano house song. It would have fit right into the 2023 house spam era, although with some likable vocal samples, particularly in the "And I Won't Let Go" sample that sounds like Ellie Goulding. But as simple as this is, maybe if the drops were decent, it could justify some of that emptiness, and I think you know where this is going. Sure, the lead has some appeal, but that horrible buzzing bass line pushed right into the front that sounds terrible, and that annoying repetitive vocal sample that gets added in only makes things worse. Then there's the music video, which is so desperate to try and replicate the meme status of Crab Rave, and it fails pretty badly. Mostly because this song is an irritating mess and is nowhere near as likable as Crab Rave. Unfortunately, this isn't even the worst from both artists. For Good Times Ahead, If You Know, You Know, and Tony Romero has a song that's even worse down the line. Basically, just repeat what I said for Atmospheres Lose It All from 2018. Although, a bit of an update on Atmospheres. I did check out some of his other songs from Hardwell, like All That We Were Living For and Hideaway, and release is also starting to grow on me. It also helps to understand what older, euphoric art style was like back then, and while I still don't like it that much, I have an even better understanding of it. But at the time, I heard enough of these songs to know when it's done well, and unfortunately, this is another dud. And it's a bit disappointing coming from Stonebank. This song has some redeeming elements with that electric guitar and Email's good vocal performance before the hardstyle drop happens and ruins the whole experience. Which, sure, that lead is still impactful, but the problem is with that underpowered kick, which is trying for some high-end approach with this impact, but it sounds really wimpy and doesn't fit with the rest of the song. If anything, this is worse than Lose It All because there's no punch to the drop. Stonebank had an okay year, but his singles felt weaker when he attempted to go down the hardstyle path rather than the happy hardcore path. And Time was the only single that worked in that regard. The rest were either okay, Scared, which honestly had a shot on the best list, and this bad attempt at euphoric raw style. Stonebank is much better than this. How? Literally, how? How can you take one of the most well-known dubstep and electro house producers and make him debut on the label with 3 horrible singles? And honestly, it was a challenge to find which one was worse out of the 3. My Destiny, Coffee Black, and New Shoes. While the blown-out design of My Destiny ruins any likability the track had, and New Shoes has some really grating synth melodies, it was ultimately the poorly executed bro-step track that made it here. The morales to open up the song aren't bad, but once we get to those drops with this mess design and off-putting sounds, it tanks whatever potential was there. I don't even know what the second drop was attempting to do with the structure. If it's trying to go for a Jersey Club switch-up, it fails badly since the synth growls have little power and the kick has very little impact. And rather embarrassingly enough, this was my first proper introduction to Feed Me. I'm glad this guy has some better songs on this label with the Silhouette remix as well as Hopeless with No Mana, because this, yikes. Because if Slender wasn't going to release anything on this label outside of a Potions remix package, I guess we'll have to buy it, pick up the pieces, and give us bad nostalgia of Slender's mediocre melodic hits. And since A Million Days became so successful, it was inevitable that more singles were going to be made. But did most of them have to sound this generic and dull? People have often described Sabai as a dollar store millennium, and while that statement is a little too harsh, This is easily the most blatant example of that influence, as so much of the song feels cribbed from Millennium's remix of Operate, and with no decent second drop, this song ends up being worse. The flat saw pads, the weaker vocal chops, the lack of any body or punch, it's an incredibly boring song on its own. The fact it feels like a copycat of an existing song makes the song worse. This would have been on the list proper, but unfortunately Sabai's filled up the maximum amount of slots with worse material. It's infuriating that to this day, this is Fool's most popular song, to the point where this got used on a Google ad once. And no, I'm not kidding. As I've said before, that Fool's worst side, at least for me, was his combination of synthwave and mid-tempo, because a lot of the mid-tempo elements from Fool sound really underwhelming during this era. And while I don't like Revenger, this was the worst example I can think of. Because my gosh, this song is boring. The synthwave is at its most generic and toned down, with the synth plucks and clap having no dynamism or creativity, and the mid-tempo switch up towards the end doesn't work either, since the production elements have the same issues. And it goes on throughout the whole 3.5 minutes. This is probably one of the few cases where keeping this short to 2.5 minutes would have helped the song more, because listening to this feels like a chore since nothing interesting happens. Why did we let this get 19 million views instead of something like Damage again?
Don't you know that I'll be here for you till we got nothing left to do? Tell a couple jokes and enjoy the view. I'll be here for you. Don't you know that?
I've said before that Mostly We Grow Part 2 was where they started morphing into the Chainsmokers of the label, but Mostly We Grow Part 3, holy crap. Most of this EP is miss after miss, with some of the most baffling production turns from this duo, to the point where the only song that is worth checking out is a collab with Dishonorable of all people via Sit Like a Flamingo. Starting out with this pop-punk trap attempt that completely goes against Half of Orange's tropical aesthetic that they've built over this series. And sure, the electric Rolex sounds fine, but the trap beat is non-existent, and Michael Malouf's on vocals trying to go outside of his comfort zone, he fails badly, as well as rapping like Black Bear on the verses. And while there's some okay concept with the lyrical content about being there for someone, the writing is really corny, even more than usual. Twists and turns so drastic, life feels like a Tarantino. Sometimes we laugh and sometimes we cry. Sometimes we get drunk and buy stuff that we find online. And the worst of all, whenever you're lost, I'm blue, I'll find some clues to see you soon. Stephen Burns, these guys are not. Again, this isn't even the worst song off of the EP, and unfortunately, that is saying something. But now, onto a list proper, starting with... For this first song, we have another single from Where It All Began by Sabai. And you guys might think I hate this artist, but I actually feel bad for Sabai. Most of that was because he had a single in 2021 that took me by complete surprise, and I could see where Sabai's potential could go. But while I feel bad for this artist, I dislike this EP quite a bit, because it basically encouraged Sabai to keep coming back to this style and completely squander any sort of potential he showcased with that single in 2021. The one not making it in his memories, which is actually quite decent, going for more of a traditional pop approach and not having some of the bad sounds of his other work. And even if it's heavily influenced by Griffin and Millennium's Feel Good, it's not a terrible influence either, since Sabai sounds can stand on their own. The same cannot be said for this. Well, at least Mercedes sounds okay on the hook, her vocals are probably the best part, and the pop-punk approach fits well with the melodic bass style that Sabai is going for, but that's basically where the positives for this song end, and all the problems lie on Sabai on production. For the most obvious point, the drops sound incredibly underwhelming. The washed out saw pads have no pulse to them, the percussion is way too thin to create any punch. How is it that the glass shattering sound effect has more impact than the entire drop? And while the guitars are fine, the vocal chops sound awful and basically became a trademark of Sabai's. They sound like Louis Capaldi if he consumed too much helium. But the big issue is how boring this song is, because outside of the drop, there's nothing else besides piano keys that have no brightness and can't create an effective mood, and the percussion reminiscent of Millennium's Ascend just not as interesting. Say what you want about William Black and Fairlane's early singles, which were also heavily influenced by Millennium, at least it has more punch and a presence to it. This feels like the safer, much more mainstream version of that sound. It might work for someone who hasn't heard the style before or who likes this style anyways, sure. But go beyond that, this song falls short. Maybe if this EP wasn't so popular, I might be more forgiving, but since it influenced so much of Sabai's sound in the worst way, yeah, songs like this are gonna be making the list. I've said before that while the worst of 2020 wasn't as bad as 2019, there was this lingering feeling to this list that previous years didn't have. Maybe it's because of my bias towards Instinct at the time, and seeing that sublabel get reduced significantly heightened that feeling for me. But I think it was also because I felt like Monstercat was much simpler back then, when the roster was much more defined and consistent. And 2020 was the moment that slowly started to change, when the label became more randomized, inconsistent, Uncaged and Instinct started to blend more than it should, had a bunch of unnecessary low points. Okay, we're not quite there yet. And some of the acts that were great in previous years just could not keep up the momentum they once had, and this is one of the biggest examples. So there's a YouTube channel by the name of Iceberg, who actually got influenced by rankers, including me of all people, and he started doing his own series of videos on Monstercat as well as NCS. I recommend you check him out. And once he made his list of the worst Monstercat songs of 2020, he had his own thoughts on this song, but I feel like him and I had the exact same thought while listening to this. What happened here? How did Throttle take the simple formula of Cities from the Where You Are EP, one of the more safe records on the project, reuse it here, and still find a way to mess it up? I like the concept of the lyrical content at least, the idea of a situation where there's too much damage to be done, and they should just keep it light since there's not a hero in this situation. And Nicolasi is good enough on vocals. I wish he was a little bit more present for this one. The problem is the production is incredibly underwhelming. From the sparse guitars that don't have enough power to really land on the verses, to the drops with that airy lead left stranded on its own, to some fizzy percussion blocks that don't have the sort of bounce or actually makes you want to dance. That's the one thing that Cities had actually going for it, and for here, it's gone. And it's also not that relaxing either, since the lead is too bombastic and the percussion has too much impact for that mood. The best way I can describe this song is that it feels like a Chainsmokers song, more specifically a weaker cut from Sick Boys. It's produced nicely enough, and lyrically there's nothing too jarring, but it leaves me longing for much better. And since we're on the subject of hero songs and the Chainsmokers, say what you want about something just like this, even if the production is thinner on that record than it is here, at least it has Coldplay to compensate. This doesn't have Coldplay or an equivalent artist, so unfortunately we get this incredibly disappointing return. Or to reference The Incredibles, you can't count on anyone, especially not your heroes. I've said before that Monstercat, while still trying to dedicate itself to a hardcore EDM demographic, would still chase trends around the mainstream. And I think that for marketing, that's a good strategy. It's one of the reasons why I even got into Monstercat in the first place. And also especially good if the song is able to do so much more than what's currently popular. About Us and Talk are great examples of that. So now we get to one of the more short-lived trends in EDM history. Slap House, a subgenre of deep house where the bass is the most prominent element of the production with very little or no melodies at all. Tiesto, A-Lock, and Loud Luxury were the only acts to really get something out of this style. And even for Tiesto, I argue it was more deep house than slap house. Two Colors and an okay cover of Love Fool by the Cardigans, and I also think Hypnotized by Gaworo and Karma Child was also good. The rest is not really worth checking out, especially ones from Iceberg, as his simplistic style ran dry fast. So what happens when Monstercat hops on the trend with a song of the same quality as those songs? It's been a while since I've talked about bows. I think I was able to warm up to their style of slap house after a while with Red and Never Let You Down, with some darker elements in the production. Illusion is a great color house song on NCS, and hey, Outer Space was at least decent. But man, did it take a while for me to really get there. And that's before mentioning their messy techno pivot today, where Ghost, now known as Gishin, has never really impressed me outside of an okay single called Run. In 2021, they released a slap house song similar to this one called No Control, and I doubt anyone remembers that because it got removed from Spotify for some reason and was never brought back. And this was my first impression, and it's only gotten worse with age. Amanda Singh's vocal performance does not work, especially the vocal cues on the drop. It gets really annoying after a while. And the production is a combination of pop, slap house, and trap that combines the worst elements of each genre. The cheesy lyrics of pop, the pointless and unnecessary trap elements towards the second verse to completely pull you out. They just don't fit. And for the slap house drops, okay, I'll admit the bass has more bite to it, but when it gets swamped out by the annoying vocal samples and when there's very little in terms of melody, the drops grow sour fast. Especially when the song later adds vocal chants that just cheapens the entire thing. And again, there are times where a cheesy pop song can still bring out some fun energy, but this is not one of those times due to how little it happens, as well as the repetitive elements becoming irritating. If I'm caught between my head and my heart, I choose my head, thank you. So here's an act I haven't talked about in a long time. Slippy. He was a trap actor who showed up in 2015 with Divided, but as the years went by, his style started to change over time, from dubstep to hard wave to color bass to his current style drum and bass. I'd only gotten interested in Slippy during his color bass era during 2022 and 2023, with his EP Extensia, Take Two with Darby, as well as Be Alright with an uncredited Grant. During 2018 and 2019, he was just kind of there for me, but in 2020, I'd argue his hard wave pivot was his worst era, especially in 2021 with Everything Means Nothing at All, with this being one of his worst songs on the label. But it's not like all of Slippy's 2020 was a disaster, even with his hard wave phase around this time, as Forum was still a good track and the last of his dubstep era before switching to hard wave with Dying, which is a fine enough single. Nothing too crazy, but not bad at all. I would even say Resonate with Danica Nadu, it was alright as well, even if it was a little weak on percussion. But in between all of those songs, we have Fatal, a case where it feels like everyone phoned in everything with absolutely nothing to take away. Micah Martin always benefits from his husky delivery and screamo vocals, but here it sounds like he meanders through his vocal performance like it was another day for him. He genuinely sounds disinterested. Then there's the production from Slippy, which starts out like any other Slippy hard wave song, where the vocals are the most prominent element with some atmospherics and metallic percussion taps, all of which are just there. And the first drop has a really weak lead and percussion, and the second tries for this future-based hybrid approach that doesn't really work at all, along with the gang vocals on both that you could barely hear, and even then, they don't sound interesting enough to matter. It's the same problem that Heroes had, yet to a worse degree. The whole thing just sounds really awkward, where it's clearly trying to be heavy, yet can't muster enough punch or drive to sell that. And if it doesn't sound like anyone's having fun making this, it's going to reflect for everyone else's enjoyment, including mine. And that is the really fatal part. I am not ready to talk about the worst single off of Most of the League Road Part 3. It's very telling that so much of this EP is filled with collaborations, and somehow outside of Dishonorable, everyone got underutilized throughout this project. Scared with World was really middle of the road for World, and doesn't have the same energy that made Too Close or Hang Up work. Fix's style just blends in with Half an Orange style in the most milquetoast way it could on Time Travel Kool-Aid, containing none of his leads and atmospherics that made Losing You or Dream State so timeless. Yet, it's still one of the better cuts. And for Nitrofun, he got the worst treatment. Not only because it's reflective of his 2020 run, more on that later, but his contributions with that horrible vocal effect on Michael Malouf's vocals end up making the song worse overall. But even with that, the worst songs on this project are the solo songs. I've already talked about Drunk Tattoo, this is even worse, and I'm starting to think video games have stronger competition than I expected.
I should have been a skater, maybe a heartbreaker, some kind of creator, simple money maker. I'm just a simple money maker.
genuinely, what was the thought process behind this? I know Half an Orange has been on this worst list before with cringy content, but this feels like a whole other beast entirely. And for once, it's not actually the lyrical content that bothers me. Talking about how Michael Maloof is just a simple moneymaker when he wishes he could be a creator or something bigger. I'll even say the line, "I'm cold but it's July," isn't half bad. No, the problem is with the performances and the production, cause wow, this sounds awful. Michael Maloof is at his most disinterested, even more so than usual, and Chillin' Dude is even worse, with his horrible auto-tune vocals on the second verse, to the point where midway through, Michael Maloof just gets layered on top and takes over. It literally sounds like they got some random dude in the city and paid him a few bucks to do a vocal feature, especially since this is the only song he has credited on Spotify. It also doesn't help matters when there will be pitched down vocal fragments left in random places of the song that do not sound pleasant or feel like it fits at all. And the production, again, just like with Drunk Tattoo, feels like Half an Orange selling out hard. The only tropical influences are the clunky xylophones, which are most noticeable thing about the production, and they sound really bad. The rest is a trap beat with some underwhelming synth leads and some synthwave elements that don't fit at all. I don't even know what the primary emotion is supposed to be. Is it supposed to be relaxed? Is it a happy or sad song? If anything, it feels like all three, and all of them fail. I don't know if this will overtake video games as Half an Orange's worst song, but right now, it's down to a few inches. Just why? When I made my worst list for 2019, I thought at the time I Can't was the worst song from Tony Romero on the label. Then I remembered he made this, and yeah, I stand corrected. This is his worst song on the label. My history has been all over the place with this. I hated this when I first heard the song, and then there was a while where I tried giving this another chance, and while I originally considered cutting this out in place of Loverous, man, Tony Romero did not have a good year in 2020. I re-listened to this in preparation for this series, and afterwards, there was no way this was escaping the list. Just because something can become an earworm and get stuck in your head, it doesn't make the song any good, or that element won't annoy you. And this is the perfect definition of the worst kind of earworm. It's a minimalist tech house cut with the phrase, "Bring me back in your bed, let me get stuck in your head," over and over again. And the sample used is not funny or pleasant either. It sounds like one of those old 2010s Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network characters where the whole personality is that their voices are annoying, like Fred or Annoying Orange. And it's not like the minimalist elements are great either. Tony Romero has done this approach before with Saint Tropez and was able to make it work due to a decent flow and some nice funk elements. Whereas here the flow is monotonous and basic with some weak synth blips where once again, just like with I Can't, the percussion is the only interesting thing, which is in better Tony Romero songs, like Saint Tropez. And because of the house spam era on Instinct in 2023, it's only gotten worse. Since if this got released in that era, it would have fit. I'm glad introspection exists and Tony Romero pivoted more towards funk in 2021 instead of doing more of this. Because while it gets stuck in your head, it might be best if you don't let it. And while we're on the topic of songs that are grating, every time I revisit this single, I have a thought that maybe it wasn't as bad as I remember it to be. And hey, there's a vocal fan base for this song, and outside of ranking channels, Naughty Stab has some good thoughts on this, and every time I do, I come to the same conclusion. Yes, this is as bad as I remember it to be. I've said my piece on Eptic before, how he's made some good singles off and on label, but Eptic was always at his worst when he goes for the screechy side of bro step, at least back then, and Propane is his worst example. The song starts out with some sharper synth design that's actually okay. There's a screamo vocal chop that's very effective, but the build-up with that repetitive vocal sample gets annoying pretty quickly, and the drops are a combination of Eptic's worst screechy sound design and bro step stabs that sound like someone's hawking loogies. It's not a pleasant sound at all, and it only gets worse worse once the second half starts, where for some reason the screechy elements are pitched up. There's also a sample of the F-bomb on the drop that tries for some comedic value, and I can hear it, but when the track sounds this irritating, it just blends in with that feeling. And as a result, the vocal chop gets annoying too. This was the moment where Eptic's sound design would shift a bit from his 2019 phase to now his current phase, which has more menace and attitude behind it. And this was where that uncanny valley really hit for me, because while this has some of Eptic's sound design, I can hear that the sound design was rough and wasn't as refined as his work in 2021, or even now. Because when you know it, during his Darkstar EP, he made a similar track called Revenge, which feels like a sequel to this song. He actually made it work, whereas this feels like an actual propane leak. Or to quote from an older Monstercat song, it's what happens when gasoline plays with matches. You get burned. Nitrofun's 2020 run was one of the most disappointing things this entire year. He started out quite nicely with Hidden Level, and the collaboration with Just a O via Killswitch, that wasn't bad either. But after Arcade, he just dipped in quality. And if it wasn't for World Wide Web and Power, this would have been his last year on this label. And the two songs that come to mind were this and System Failure. System Failure seems to get the most hate, and I absolutely get why. It's a dated bro step track that feels like a worse version of Addicted with no power or energy. And believe me, it was close to making this list. But as much as I don't like that song, I can at least tolerate it. But with this, safe to say, I've had enough of this nonsense. I think I owe Spooky an apology, because when it comes to Halloween releases, at least it's not as bad as this. Which starts out fine enough with the organs and chiptune leads for Nitrofun, and then the drops happen with those horrible gurgling synth tones, and it immediately turns me off. And especially when it swamps out the house percussion, which doesn't get much room. And the problem is that it's everywhere, on the build-up, on the off-drops with the Kill Bill sample that doesn't quite work, and the only time you get a break is during the midsection and intro. And while the midsection isn't terrible, the chiptune leads are at least pleasant. By the time the second drop happens with that same annoying synth design, by that point, none of it matters. A large problem with Nitrofun's 2020 era was that, with the exception of Hidden Level, his chiptune design dipped and was making the songs actively worse. Arcade with Half an Orange has some really horrible sounding vocal filters, and System Failure sounded dated even by 2014 standards of Nitrofun, or dubstep in general. But this is easily the worst example of Nitrofun's dip in design appeal. Again, I'm glad that Nitrofun was able to make a return in 2024 with World Wide Web, and especially Power. Thankfully, they have good chiptune design, because this, just no. But say what you want about Propane or Warp Zone, at least Eptic and Nitrofun have other material to go back to. When Eptic isn't screechy, he can make a good old song like Cosmic or Swords and Dragons, and his newer style is much more refined. Darkstar might actually be my favorite release project from him. Noctane off of Never Say Die Volume 7, that was great as well. And Nitrofun still has New Game, Time Goes By, So Far Away, etc. It also helps that they weren't the most popular singles of either artist. Whereas here, this was one of, if not the biggest Monstercat song of the year. And if you're familiar with this year, you probably know where this is going. But the song as a whole isn't why this is so high, but for what it represents for both artists in question. Why do I keep coming back to this song? And it reminds me so much of the story of Slander, an act that debuts on the label with a future-based hit that becomes super popular despite a growing amount of negative reception, to the point where the act stays on Monstercat to produce even more material of varying quality before going off-label and improving at such a slow rate that so many of the issues they had before are still present. And let me make this clear. The song is bad enough to make the list on its own. The production is similar to Broken Glass, just with even less pathos. But there's not a whole lot going on in the first production with the piano keys before getting into the drops where Wong recycles production elements from Gone, and Tobias' horrible vocal chops are front and center, and are at their worst here. The underwhelming aspect to the production elements is also present here, and there's nothing to latch on to outside of the vocals from Olivia originally. And the lyrics? Songs like this are why I praised a lot of the unapologetic pop material in 2018 to 2019. This song all about Olivia Ridgely having a crush on a guy after staying a night, and she wishes he could stay for 1,000,000 days. About how she misses the person after he says her name with his accent, or how she wishes to be a summer in December. Somehow Half an Orange came up with a better line from Simple Moneymaker with I'm cold but it's July, and the tone takes itself way too seriously, so there's a lack of self-awareness to how cheesy this all sounds. But the reason why this is so high is because both Sabai and Hwang are stuck in this style, especially Hwang, whose style has remained stagnant ever since. And Sabai, I've heard his other stuff before. He's clearly capable of making some great material. He has a song on my best list of 2021, but since his style is what made him so popular, he kept going back to it, and as a result hindered his potential in the long run, to the point where on his album North Star, he made 2 songs with Hwang again that repeated this exact same style, the self-titled track and Daydream, the latter of which feels like a direct sequel with the exact same problems. I wouldn't say this is worse than Superhuman, since at least this has more of a body, but you know what? At least Slender has All You Need to Know and Love Is Gone to fall back on. Tobiah just says this, and it's likely going to be his biggest song he'll make. And that's really sad to see. This one might surprise people that this is at the top. This was hated back then, but I think some people might consider the song too bland to put on a list like this. But throughout 2020, Instinct plummeted compared to 2019, especially when it came to the worst. I've said before in previous years that the worst of Instinct was either really bland pop songs with a lack of personality, or cheesy lyrics that could not muster enough in the production in order to compensate, or cross a line into absolutely ridiculous territory. 2020 was when I discovered a new brand of worst for Instinct, one that didn't cross my mind until hearing this song. And for these 2 artists to make it, it's shocking. I've said before how the blending of Uncaged and Instinct was a big issue, and what I mean by that is that an Uncaged track would appear on an Instinct slot, like Let Go by Good Times Ahead, or an Instinct track would appear on an Uncaged slot, and only Uncaged benefited from this change. Whereas Instinct, you get songs like this. Let's get this over with. 10 million views, everyone, making this nonsense his biggest song on the label, and for Snouse, one of his most prominent songs. All for one of the most rushed and poorly executed songs I have ever heard on Instinct. And unlike A Million Days, there's no vocal performance to latch onto. In fact, there's literally nothing in this song to latch onto. Taking Nonsense's hollow design is most unappealing and dull, and fusing it with a beyond standard trap percussion and atmospherics from Snouse, as well as a Jersey Club switch up that makes Poison's attempt at that genre sound good by comparison. It also represents a massive low point for both Nonsense and Snouse. For the former, it made me realize that even though Nonsense is better off of Instinct and Uncaged, that doesn't mean they're incapable of making bad songs on this sub-label. And as for Snouse, this would basically be the beginning of his downfall. There's a reason why Us didn't make the best list in 2019, because I'm still trying to recover from this era of Snouse, especially in 2021 with You and Me and Change Us. There's also the question of what else he even did beyond the reverb vocal effects and trap percussion, because his style is nowhere else in the song. But then you have to factor where this got placed to the label. Because remember, this is on Instinct, a song that for most people they either don't like or don't really care about. And that's when I realized, this song opened up a new low point for the sub-label, where the blending of sub-labels is at its worst. Because it's not like an Out of the Dark by No Mana or Calling Us by Beckett Peters situation, where an Uncaged track ends up on Instinct for some reason despite the style not really matching, or in a mood sense where there's a darker edge to the track while still remaining a track like on Instinct, like with Tails' catalog. No, this feels like a track that sounds like an Uncaged demo track that the artist forgot to properly utilize, so the track sounds unfinished stylistically. And since it sounds too tame for that sub-label at the time, it got put on Instinct instead. So that frustration from Instinct in 2020 throughout this entire list, that's where that feeling peaked for me. And for that reason, it's the worst Monstercat song of 2020. There isn't a single thing that works for me on this song, and say what you want about Nonsense's catalog, at least Better or Trouble, they had somewhat of a personality. So here you go, Golden. A crown for a king. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, really appreciate it. Best list is coming soon, so stay tuned for that. But until then, I will see you all soon.